Well, it's great to be with you guys this morning. We're continuing in our series in Mark. We'll be in Mark 5, 21 through 43. So we got 22 verses that we're going to cover. And man, this passage is just rich with gospel allusions, all types of ways that I could have taken this message. So if you read this passage and you're like, man, I can't believe Dawson didn't go there. If I went in every direction, we'd be here for a really long time. So what you can do is if I missed a part of the passage that you need some explanation to, you can go ahead and email Mark. He loves to give long-winded explanations via email, so he would love to field that for you. But anyways, I'm excited to be with you guys this morning. Mark 5, 21 through 43. And before we get into the passage, I'll just give you a quick update on my life. So one thing that's happened to me recently is I've been in a little bit of a quarter-life crisis, right? So this year I turned 28. We had our second son. What? 28? Okay, all right, whatever. So I turned 20. It feels big to me. So I turned 28, and I had my second son. And then on top of that, I got diagnosed with a rare autoimmune disease that attacks my muscles. So now when I make decisions, I've got to consult my wife, my doctor. I've got to consider my kids. Before I could just go and spend money on myself. I could pick up a new hobby. We could go and travel whenever we pleased. And so now I just feel like I'm a little bit more grounded. I'm a little bit more in place than I was. And so it's not a bad wrestle, but it's a wrestle nonetheless. And one of the things that's really been bothering me a lot, and it sounds like a joke, but it's not, is I'm wrestling with the reality that I can no longer be a Navy SEAL. Even if I wanted to, I couldn't. And so what's happening is I'm realizing that this window of opportunity has passed, and I'm having to grieve this loss, that I can't be a Navy SEAL or a Delta Force operator even if I wanted to. So that's been hard for me. So what my grieving process has looked like is I've been growing out my beard, right? I've been trying to lift weights a little bit more often, and I've been watching a whole lot of military documentaries and been getting into American history. And so one discovery that I found in my grieving process was the story of George Washington. So George Washington, if you didn't know, he grew up in a really esteemed home. He was wealthy, he was respected, and when he was 20 years old, he became an officer in the British military. So he was really informed on the dignified, respectable, and formal way of war that the British engaged in. They'd wear their red coats, they'd get in a line, they'd have a drummer. This was seen as the gentleman's way of war. Several years later, though, what we would find is that the Americans would go to war with the British, and George Washington would actually be the commander of the American army. But what George Washington found is that his army was comprised of a bunch of impoverished farmers, tradesmen, and slaves, and the British army was trained, paid, professional military men. So George Washington, he recognized, look, my strategy, if we're going to win this war, it's got to be different. And so he threw out the formal way of warfare, and he said, you know what? I'm going to employ sneak attacks. I'm going to retreat to preserve my army when I need to, and I'm going to lose land if I have to just to stay in the fight. And so what his strategy did is it garnered an incredible amount of criticism. What was said about George Washington was that he was a coward, a cheater, and a direct quote here says, he has a profound talent at running away. The Americans, though, they would ultimately go on and win the war. We would gain liberty from Britain, but what George Washington had to decide in the midst of battle was that his dignified and respectable image did not matter if it meant losing the war. What he determined is that losing but still having your personal sense of self-dignity was still a loss, and the stakes were far too great for him to care about his public image. He was willing to be criticized or look like a coward in order to win the war. And why this is important for us today is because sanctification, salvation, and obedience to Christ comes at the expense of our self-image. It comes at the expense of our dignity, right? The reality is that if you desire to obey God, you may have to lay some of these things down in the way that Washington did. And what you'll find is that when you do lay down your self-image, when you lay down your dignity, your self-importance, what you'll find is you actually do gain a sense of dignity. It's restored dignity in Christ. So our thesis, if you're taking notes, is we must be willing to forfeit our dignity to gain Christ. We must be willing to forfeit your dignity to gain Christ. We'll be in Mark 5, 21 through 43, and I'll read that for us. It says this, "And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him. And he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, 'My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, that she may be made well and live.' And he went with him, and a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, who had suffered much at the hands of many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus, and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, 'If I touch even his garments, I will be made well.' And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt her body was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, 'Who touched my garments?' And his disciples said to him, 'You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, "Who touched me?" And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, 'Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease.' While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, 'Your daughter is dead. Why bother the teacher any further?' But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, 'Do not fear, only believe.' And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John and the brother of James. They came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion of people weeping and wailing loudly. And he had entered and said to them, 'Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but rather sleeping.' And they laughed at him, but he took all of them outside and took the child's mother and father and those who were with them, and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, 'Talitha cumi,' which means, 'Little girl, I say to you, arise.' And immediately the girl got up and she began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat." This is the word of the Lord. Awesome. So before we go into exegeting this passage, there's some important notes to take about the context. So where we're at, we're kind of in this crescendo of stories. So a couple weeks ago, we were in the story where Jesus, he calmed the wind and the waves. Last week, we saw Jesus cast out the demons from the demoniac. And then this week, we see Jesus healing both a disease and a little girl from death. So what we're seeing is that Jesus is Lord of nature, the wind and the waves. He's Lord over the spiritual realm by casting out demons. He's Lord over our bodies and disease. And he's also Lord over life and death itself. And so this is where we're heading today. And the way the story is set up is that we see Jairus on the scene first, falling down at the feet of Jesus. And then it progresses to what seems to be an interruption in the text, the woman that is bleeding. And then it concludes with Jairus and his daughter being healed by Jesus. And so that's the order that I'm going to be preaching in this morning. So let's first look at Jairus. It says that Jairus was a ruler of the synagogue. So what this means is he was well educated, he was respected, his public image mattered, he was in circles of importance socially. And what he was doing is he was falling down at the feet of Jesus. Jesus at this time was known as a heretic. He was challenged and criticized by Pharisees. So Jairus falling down at the feet of Jesus would have been incredibly costly. It would have cost him his position in the synagogue. It would have cost him his self-image. It would have cost him many of his relationships, but still willing to fall down at the feet of Jesus to plead for the healing of his daughter. This makes me wonder in our personal lives, where do you need healing? But maybe your sense of self-importance is getting in the way. Like you need Jesus in your life, but you're so concerned about your position, your self-importance, your image, that you're unwilling to fall down at the feet of Jesus, surrender all of it, and give it up for him, that you may be healed. Point number one, if you're taking notes, is this. It's you need to have a willingness to surrender position or public image. The reality is that Jairus, in this story, he was willing to surrender all of it. And what he found was the presence of Jesus and Jesus' healing power in his life. So what happens next is Jesus, he's on his way to heal Jairus' daughter. And what happens is that there's a woman who's unclean in the crowd. She's been hemorrhaging for the last 12 years. Just the fact that she was in the crowd would have been incredibly risky. I mean, women at this time, during their time of the month, they weren't allowed to be in public. They were deemed as unclean. This woman had been unclean for 12 years. So the fact that she was in a crowd alone was super risky. She was an isolated and sick person due to her condition. But yet she goes out in close proximity to others, hoping that she's not noticed. The scriptures say that she had gone to many physicians, but had not gotten better and had only gotten worse. And then, in the meantime, she'd also spent all that she had. I think that this is an incredible depiction of us and our sin. I think that we have this illness and we go to all of these things looking for healing. Like we pour ourselves into hobbies, into our job, right? We try to upgrade our house, our car, whatever the case, to heal ourselves from this sickness that we're experiencing. What ends up happening is on the other side of that. Not only do we not get healed, not only are we more tired and more hopeless because nothing is working, but we've spent all that we've had on these fake healers. And so this is where this woman has found herself today, is not only is she sick, not only is she isolated and hopeless, but now she's also impoverished as a result of spending all that she's had. But then this woman, she hears about Jesus. So she hears about Jesus and she goes and she joins this crowd and she's doing it as sneakily as possible. She thinks to herself, if I can just reach out and touch Jesus, then maybe I can be healed. So she reaches out, she touches Jesus. To her surprise and satisfaction, she's healed immediately. And then Jesus, he turns around and says, who is it that touched me? And then he also felt power leave him. What this tells us about Jesus, the fact that he felt power leave him, this is like a remarkable reality. What this shows us is that he felt it when he healed her. Like something about him, like he was affected by his own generosity. And what we find out is that several short chapters later, when we look to the crucifixion, Jesus doesn't lose a little bit of power for healing, but he loses his life. He completely empties himself on our behalf on the cross. And so this is an allusion to that moment. And upon feeling power leave him, Jesus immediately turned around and he asked the crowd, who touched me? The woman knew that she wasn't supposed to be in the crowd. She knew that she wasn't supposed to touch somebody, and she definitely knew that she wasn't supposed to touch a priestly figure like Jesus. So I imagine when Jesus turns and asks, who touched me? She's filled with fear, thinking that she would be imprisoned or put to death. So she is terrified, but what she does is she musters up the courage to come to Jesus and tell him the whole truth. What ends up happening is Jesus heals her of her disease and says, peace be with you. Be healed. But she laid it all out there. She was completely vulnerable to Christ. And this makes me ask myself the question and ask the question of us. When is the last time that we told ourselves, we told Jesus, and we told a brother and sister in Christ the whole truth? The whole truth. I think we have this tendency to tell partial truths, right? But what happens is when we tell a partial truth, we only experience partial relief from our sin. I think we do this thing where we confess some sin, but we still leave the root of it just free to roam around in our conscience. I think this is what I mean. I think we confess sin like this, like, hey, pray for me, I've been struggling with temptation. But what you should be praying is, I've been dealing with a pornography addiction for 15 years. I feel worthless. Every time I feel just this deep sense of sadness, I turn to pornography for comfort rather than God. I've been doing it for so long that I'm not even convicted anymore. I don't even feel bad. Or maybe your confession is like this, like, pray for me, I've had a bad attitude at the house. But really, you feel unloved, you feel uncared for, you take your resentment out on your spouse, you've been harboring resentment for years, then on the other side of your kids leaving your house for college, you don't know if your marriage will make it. Do you want freedom from sin. Well, if you want freedom from sin, you got to bring it all to light. I think we have this tendency to allow sin space to exist in the shadows of our soul, but we need to tell others, tell ourselves, and tell Jesus the whole truth. John Owen, he's a Puritan pastor. If there was a betting line on whether or not I was going to quote a Puritan, bet that I will. I'm always going to quote a Puritan. I love those guys. But John Owen, he wrote this book entitled The Mortification of Sin. And in this book, The Mortification of Sin, he's talking about how to kill sin. But what he says that believers need to do is we need to forsake the generalities and we need to move into the particulars. And what he meant by this is that we confess sin in a way that's general. Like we keep it general. I'm struggling with temptation. I'm struggling with some big blanket statement, because if we get into the particulars, what happens is we get uncomfortable. We lose control of the narrative, right? And it's convenient. We have this, it kind of feels therapeutic when we confess sin, we confess this general thing and it feels helpful, but you're not actually getting to the reality of your sin. I want to tell you that there's nothing that sanctifies you that is ever that convenient. You will not grow by making your sin appear to be more palatable. You won't be healed by justifying your behavior, and you won't become holier by trying to make your sin seem more appropriate. So long as your confessions are general, controllable, and convenient, your sin will not be dealt with. I think another thing to consider as we look at confession is when we tell part truths, what you're actually saying is my sin is safer with me than it is with God. Like I want to maintain control of this because I don't trust God to have complete control of it. So your partial confession, it may seem innocent to you, but in reality what you're saying is that my sin and myself is on the throne of my life rather than God. What I can tell you is that your sin is far safer in the hands of God than it is in your own. So my encouragement for us today, what I believe God is asking of us, is to tell the whole truth. Relinquish control of the narrative. Share with God the depths of your sin so He can forgive you to the utmost. I promise you, your sin is safer with Him than it is with you. So this woman, she figures that she can be healed quietly. She figures that she can do it in isolation, that she can just touch Jesus and be unnoticed. But Jesus makes her healing a public profession, right? He doesn't allow her to go unnoticed, and so she confesses in front of everybody. But here's what happens, is that Jesus says, go in peace. So peace comes after her confessing the whole truth. So point number 2 is this, is you need to have a willingness to confess the whole truth. A willingness to confess the whole truth. So the story goes on. Jesus, he continues to walk with Jairus. They get to his house. The people in Jairus' house, what they say to Jesus is they say, hey, Jairus, don't bother the teacher anymore. Your daughter's already dead. Don't trouble the teacher. Don't bug him too much. This is a lost cause. We're hopeless. It doesn't matter anymore. And I think that this is a great depiction of what it looks like to totally misunderstand Jesus. They said it's a lost cause because they didn't understand that Jesus wasn't just a teacher. That they didn't understand that God himself, the healer, the bringer of hope, was in the room with them. And so they say, don't trouble the teacher. How often do we look at our situations and we lose hope? We quit being persistent in the way that we ask of God. We think to ourselves, I'm going to quit troubling the teacher. I know for myself, half of my family doesn't believe in Jesus. And what's happened to me is at some point, I've lost hope for their salvation. At some point, I've decided to myself, I'm going to quit being persistent with what I'm asking for God. I'm going to stop troubling the teacher. But in reality, we all know this. Jesus is not just a teacher. He is the Lord. And Jesus is not troubled by the persistent requests of his children. Thomas Goodwin, another Puritan, he says this, a father is not troubled when his child comes to him for a glass of water. It is his delight to do it. And shall we think that Christ, whose love is infinitely beyond that of the best father, should be troubled with the petitions of his children? No. He accounts it his glory to give out grace, and it is his joy that we come to him. My son, Boston, he's 2 years old, and he's kind of figured out a toddler life hack. So what he's found is that when he comes up to me and looks at me and goes, Mo Dada, which is more dad, but when he says Mo Dada, he gets chunked in the air as high as I can. And so I could be doing anything. I could be like working on something. It's Olympic season. I could be watching the Olympics, doing chores, whatever. But when I see my little boy run up to me and go, "Mo Dada," I'll tell you it is not an inconvenience, but it is my pleasure to run outside and chunk that dude as high as I can. And I got to tell you that it's the same with your requests for God. You aren't troubling the teacher, but in fact, you are making a request to an all-loving and infinitely resourceful Father. Another interesting aspect of this story is we look at it and we see Jairus, he's asking for the healing of his daughter, and then Jesus, there's this apparent interruption where the woman enters the scene. And I just imagine that Jairus was frantic, anxious, trying to get Jesus to his daughter as quickly as possible, but we see Jesus willing to stop. We see him seemingly make a pit stop for this woman, and what this tells us is that Jesus' pace is different than our own. I think there's so many things in our lives where we think that our timeline's not working. Like we're losing hope because the timeline doesn't make sense in our minds. But Jesus is unhurried. And the reason why he's unhurried is because he holds time in his hands and he himself determines the outcome. Additionally, I think it's incredible to consider that Jesus in a life or death situation would stop for the woman. Somebody in our small group this week posed the question, are we interruptible? Like Jesus here had margin in his life. He was interruptible to the point that if God put somebody in his life, he was willing to stop, be with them, pray for them, heal them. And this is another question about our self-importance. Is your calendar too packed? Are you too important that if God put something in your life that you'd be able to stop and take care of that, to be able to be okay with a holy interruption? Are we interruptible? So these people in Jairus' home, they tell Jesus, don't bother the teacher. Jesus responds by saying, do not fear, only believe. The crowd then comes to Jesus. They're weeping and they're wailing. And Jesus says to them, why are you making a commotion? The child is not dead and only sleeping. Again, this just shows that Jesus views suffering and finality differently than we do. To the world, this girl's in a hopeless state, but to Jesus, he only needs to wake her up. The crowd then laughs at Jesus, and the passage goes on to say that Jesus, he took those that were wailing outside and he went in with them to the house with Jairus and his wife, and he heals Jairus' daughter. So what we see in this passage with Jairus is that there's two instances that were invitations to Jairus to give up hope. We see them say, hey, don't bother the teacher anymore. Don't bug Jesus. He's got enough on his plate. Your daughter's already dead. Just go ahead and join us over here. Join the crowd. And then another instance where Jesus says, no, the daughter's only sleeping. I need to wake her up. And they laugh at him, right? But we see Jairus, he's persistent. He stays with Jesus. He doesn't lose hope. And he sides with Jesus rather than the crowd, even if he looks foolish. So point number 3, as we're talking about losing our dignity, you need to have a willingness to believe in Jesus even when you look foolish. To do as Jairus did, forsake the crowd, and follow Christ. A final observation about this text is we see that Jairus and this woman were on very different ends of the spectrum. Jairus, he was important, he was a ruler of the synagogue, he was wealthy, he was educated in social circles. And then we see the woman who was diseased, isolated, impoverished. But we see her dealing with immense suffering. What we see is that nobody in the room is immune to suffering. And what's remarkable is that Jesus happens to be the cure for both sides of the spectrum. Regardless of where you're at, regardless of what you're suffering with, Jesus is the answer. I think that this message is important for us as a church today because I look around the room, see a lot of really beautiful people, beautiful families, marriages, or at least gives the appearance of. Many of us are well-educated or proud circles. And my fear is that our personal sense of dignity could make us unwilling to be a humble vessel in the hands of God. I believe that self-respect is a silent killer. And we may self-respect ourselves in a way that we are unwilling to ascribe undignified worship and undignified obedience to God. So I want to encourage you this morning that you need to be absolutely willing to look undignified in the presence of God. Why? Why though? And the reality is it's because God suffered a total loss of dignity on our behalf. When we look at this story, it wasn't just Jairus and the bleeding woman that lost their dignity. But at the same time, Jesus was losing his dignity. He touched both the bleeding woman and the dead child. And what this would have done is this would have been Jesus taking their curse on himself. He would have been declared unclean, but he's willing to take it on. And then we see the crowd laugh at Jesus. So what we see is simultaneously the King of glory himself is humbling himself with those who sought him. Another example of we see God losing his dignity on our behalf is in the story of the prodigal son. So in the story of the prodigal son, we see this wealthy, elderly man. He's a patriarch in his community. And we see his son who squandered his inheritance on prostitutes and gambling. And we see the patriarch look off in the distance and see his son coming towards him. And what the elderly man does is he runs as fast as he can to his son, completely unashamed. But what you may not know about this story is for this time and place in this culture, patriarchs did not run. This would have been scandalous and shameful. This would have been an unbelievable thing for him to do. Tim Keller says this of the matter: the father's running to the son would have been shocking and scandalous. Patriarchs did not run. Children did. For the father to run to the son meant a total loss of dignity. The father was totally undignified and unashamed in his pursuit of the son. One crazy thing about this story, like this is how profound this truth is in other parts of the world. In the Middle East and in many other cultures, the story is not referred to as the prodigal son, but it's referred to as the running father. The running father. This is a profound truth about God, that he would become undignified for us. God is unconcerned with his self-image. Although he is worthy to be praised because of his love for us and his pursuit of us, he's willing to put himself in positions that seem shameful and reckless. And then the last example I have of Jesus being undignified on our behalf is the most scandalous of all, and maybe the most obvious, but it is the cross. Not only does God become undignified in that he becomes man, he becomes more undignified in that he becomes a lower-class Jewish carpenter. Even more so in that he's sentenced to a criminal's death. Even more in the way that he's mocked and scorned. More undignified in the way that he is stripped, whipped, torn open, pierced, flogged, and murdered on our behalf. This is an utterly undignified love for us. God gave every part of himself for you. The self-respecting thing for God to have done would have been to make us meet him halfway with his love. It would have been to maybe make us earn his love rather than coming to us, but rather, God gave himself completely. He stooped himself to the utmost, and he condescended himself on our behalf. This is a relentless, self-forsaking, humiliating, condescending, and undignified love that God has for us. So in this story, we see two people. We see Jairus, and then we see the bleeding woman. And what we see is both of these people, they saw Jesus, and they fell down at his feet in worship. They completely became undignified in his presence, and what they found was the healing power of Christ in their lives. So the question for you today is this: is you can have your self-respect, your sense of self-importance, you can have your dignity, or you can forsake all of it and gain Christ. So what will it be? What will it be? I think what you'll find, though, is that Scripture is true. And when you forsake your self-importance, when you forsake your identity, you're actually going to find it. It's going to be restored, and it's going to be Christ-centered. I'll close by reading this verse in Matthew 16:25. It says this: "For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." It just so happens that when you lose your life for the sake of the gospel, you actually find it. And today, as we come to a close, we're going to take of the Lord's table. What we know about Jesus is that he lost his life on our behalf so that we would find it. When we come to the table, what we get to do is we get to remember the loss of life, the loss of dignity, that Jesus was pierced and torn open and just gave of himself completely for our healing. So as you come to the table, we get to remember that together, that our newfound dignity is that we are children of God, a part of an eternal, victorious family that reigns in heaven forever. This is an awesome thing.